almost about 3 years ago when I met with Ralph, and then we started talking about our different toolkits together. And I think there was a common interest in developing more agency-related frameworks where we can sort of put agency at the crux of behavioral public policy. And we did come up with a new name for this framework. We called it the Behavioral Agency Framework. And after writing it for 3 years, we decided we didn't really like it. So we kept that paper aside, and we said we're going to revisit it in a few years. But then this happened last year at the IBPPC, the conference, when we put forward a panel, and it was a really nice discussion. A lot of you were there, and this was a byproduct of that panel discussion where we've sort of tried to put together our thoughts on why agency is important, and we try to define agency. I know Malte is here and Paul's here, and they have a new paper on their conceptualization of agency, on capabilities and sort of opportunities and process. So we have a bit different conceptualization. So what I'm going to do today is briefly share with you these ideas and how we think the field should be reformed, and be interested to hear all your thoughts going forward. So the motivation for all of this actually was the fact that libertarian paternalism is almost reaching about 2 decades this year. The first paper came out in 2003. There were a couple of papers that were discussed at a symposium, I guess in 1998, with the idea that there's a new political philosophy that could work, which is, we can be libertarian in keeping people's freedom, but still be paternalistic in sort of guiding them towards a certain choice as it deemed right by the policymaker. And more popularly, this is famously known as the nudge. Lots of books, I think one of the highest selling books in this field. The last version coming out last year, essentially what a nudge does, as you all know, is that it represents how choices are shown to people. So it changes this choice architecture, but it doesn't ban anything or make them more expensive. So that's sort of the definition that I'll go with, because there are lots of definitions. And we know there's an ambiguity problem here. And again, just for context, it has been widely applied to many settings. Again, a lot of you are familiar with this map from the OECD that shows more than 200 institutions. I think 202 now are currently using these behavioral insights for public policies. A couple of books out there that tells us how we do so. And also so much so that we really have a new field that is being developed now, which started off from this place of nudging, but has really grown these days to incorporate lots more toolkits, as sort of Adam's public policy cube shows us. But it seems to be that we are at crossroads, and this has been my motivation for, I think, the last 7 years since I started my PhD, that with the nudge, it is particularly problematic for a lot of reasons. And even when the word nudge was introduced and the BIT was being formed in the UK, there was a sunset clause, which basically gave them a year to show if they're cost effective or not. So there's a code from back in the days, I think 2011, after the inquiry ended, when Julia said that a nudge in the right direction won't run the big society. And it seems that we're coming back to that kind of a feeling these days with all the different kinds of papers that are being published. So you see, again, you all are familiar with these papers, the RCTs to scale, that shows that, the effectiveness is lost when you try to scale them up. It goes almost to a fifth. The more controversial sort of INS frame, which almost claimed that our focus on nudging has led behavioral public policy astray. And then all the different kinds of meta-analysis that tried to put together different kinds of nudge and different kinds of domain, and showed that, it varies from almost no effects to sort of mild and sometimes substantial effects, but correcting for publication biases or sort of these skewness, you actually end up with almost no effects of the nudge. So it's really controversial, this literature, in terms of where we're headed. But I tend to sort of think of these problems in 2 different fields. So one is about the effectiveness. And one of the problems is that people oftentimes do not internalize automatic responses. Now, you might say, well, not all nudges are automatic, and I agree with you. That is what I do explore in my other research, that yes, some nudges sometimes have deliberative capacities. Oftentimes, when you interact with the nudge multiple times, you become aware of the nudge. But I think most of the times, a nudge is effective in the first shot because it is automatic and it is sort of pruning off, it's eating off some of our biases. But as you grow more aware of it, the temporality sort of goes away. And this is a very important point that we make in this paper, that the starting point matters. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a couple of slides down the line. The second reason we argue is that people oftentimes have very core habits, strong prior preferences. So oftentimes, if you try to sort of nudge them in a certain direction when they don't have reason for acting in such a way, these nudges might backfire. And again, there are lots of papers, but a lot of my papers now that show that, yeah, when these preferences don't align, these kind of backfires are even more prominent. And then again, work by Lowenstein and Hagman trying to show that these nudges crowd out support for other interventions. So there can be warm glow and reduces your motivation. So effectively leads to a lot of perverse incentives. But also there is a scaling problem here where we face the limits to scale. So these are all the different kinds of effectiveness issues that we see around nudging, particularly because of an absence of reason that the nudge provides to people. I think the second concern that we sort of describe in this paper, but more generally in our work, is about the ethics of using a nudge and sort of manipulating people. They oftentimes compromise what we call is the agency, which is people's ability to form intentions and really act on them. And again, this is something I'm going to talk to you in a few slides. Again, this is core to our definition. And slightly different from, I think, what Malte and Paul do when they describe the process. They're more interested in the process and the opportunities. We're more interested in the starting point where people sort of start out from in terms of this agency. And again, lots of work there. I'm not going to go through them. So we think these problems of nudging relate to its political philosophy. And I've just quoted Taylor and Sunstein really from the 2003 papers. Toward the end of the paper, it's a really nice, crisp paper. They suggest how social planners should really choose amongst possible systems. The first one is a standard cost-benefit analysis, very econ-style thinking. You compare and compute the net benefits and then go on with the policy. But then it gets slightly nuanced where they say that, yeah, if people don't have revealed preferences really, and you don't have these informations about the starting points, what do you really do? And they put forward three principles there that you should go with what the majority would choose, or you make people to sort of explicitly give out their choices, or you select an approach which really minimizes the opt-out. And the goal, they say, should be, yeah, if you don't know the starting point, rather than trying to do random things, you should just choose a policy that is sort of suitably defined to promote welfare. So at the core of libertarian paternalism, we think there is a disregard for the starting point of citizens. And again, we're not claiming this. This is from the paper where they say that the starting point can't be selected, and therefore you should go for indirect proxies. And sometimes they also say the starting point is irrelevant for making decisions if you can just nudge them to what they think is good. Now, our claim is that the starting point matters. And the reason it matters is because we think the starting point allows you to have some reason to develop intentions, which then allows you to undertake some kind of meaningful behavior change, which can only be sustained and is also ethical. So for example, in the paper, we discuss the classic 401k scheme. And we say that, yeah, when you're automatically defaulted, the reason you change your behavior is not because you're accepting this policy. It's not because you're reasoning the policy. It's just because it's a non-intentional, non-reasoned behavior which happens. So if I take away the nudge because you haven't reasoned it, because you don't have agency, that behavior change is not likely to stick. And similarly, in other sort of definitions of and evaluations of this nudge policy, it's also been shown that actually some people can be also negatively affected by the nudge. It's only on the average that this nudge might seem to have an effect. So to give you an example of our formalization of this agency, think of this example. You're sleeping alone at night and you hear a noise. I shared these slides with Peter and the others, by the way, and they thought it was too snazzy for this audience. If you really feel it is too snazzy, I apologize. It's just good for the storytelling. So you're sleeping alone at night, you hear a noise and you're woken up. Now you get up and you sort of turn on the lights. This is your second action that you're getting involved in. Now, these lights startle the thief and they scream, ah. So there are three different kinds of things going on here, really. There is an intentional action, which is you hear a noise, you reason something is going on, and you turn on the lights. There is unintentional action here, which is you don't have a reason, but because you've done something that leads to another action, which is the lights have startled the burglar. And then there is a non-action behavior, which is the final effect, which is the burglar scheming. And this is sort of the standard theory of agency that we're conceptualizing here, which is some sort of a cause and effect relationship where there has to be a cause for a certain effect, which is your final behavior change. And we argue in the paper that a lot of current behavioral public policies, particularly these automatic cues, what they do is they trigger this unintentional action which leads to this non-action behavior. And because you do not accept the reasoning for these kinds of behaviors, they don't stick. So we are arguing in a way to reform this behavioral public policy toolkit so that everything is intentional to begin with, everything is reasoned to begin with, so that the final behavior stick with you and go through. And here, I think there is a lot of parallel sort of with what Malte and Paul argue with the process. I think we really want to improve this process where people have their own abilities to come up with the decision that they can stick with rather than sort of being something which is unintentional. Now, our proposition of the paper corely is that we need to build agency in behavioral public policy. And we define this agency, as I've said, as our ability to build intentions free of any sort of cues, free of any sort of influence, and also then giving people the ability to act on them. And here I often give this example that I have a friend, Malte, and I met Malte at IBPPC. In front of everybody, I asked him, "Hi, Malte, do you want to donate to my conference?" And Malte is in a spotlight here. And probably he likes me, but he also thinks that others are watching him. So he probably says yes. Now, the other time, I just give Malte an email like I did this time. And Malte says, "Hey, I'm traveling, this time maybe I can't donate. I can't come to your conference." So typically, I think when things happen under the influence of something versus when you have the complete freedom to do something, the final choices can be very different. And these nudges, well, not all of them, but most of them, they affect your capabilities to form these intentions and act on them. And there's a lot of work from Cass that shows that this ex post transparency is fine. You tell people what's going on and they accept the reason. And we argue that, well, your preferences have already been affected. So yes, you are agreeing to all of them, but that might not be the same as giving them the choice to begin with without the presence of the nudge. So we think that these nudges undermine and distort your true preferences, your genuine preferences, which otherwise could have actually led you to a different counterfactual without the nudge. And again, in the paper, we sort of put forward reasoning that building this kind of agency in BPP will allow people to articulate their own preferences in a much better way. It also fosters a very different kind of a dialogue between citizen and state, in terms of the feedback they generate. So this is sort of a bit of an anecdote, but last year, Peter and I, we got involved heavily in a British Academy project with COVID, and we wanted to increase people's vaccination intentions across the G7. So we did like a panel study with almost 50,000 people, comparing some agency toolkits versus standard nudges. And the nudge in this case was a classic vignette where people were told that, yeah, your local clinic automatically enrolls you into receiving a vaccine. And then we tried the Nudge Plus, which I'm going to talk a bit more, but maybe some of you know, where we allowed people to sort of reflect on this policy before this nudge was presented to them. And then we asked them, how would you respond to the nudge? Now, the results were quite interesting in this. In all the conditions, we asked people to first report their intentions to go with this kind of a policy, and second, to ask them for the support for the policy. And what we found that in a standard default nudge setting, the nudge backfired, so it reduced people's intentions. No one was really willing on average to go with the nudge and take it for themselves. But when we asked people for support of this policy, they actually said, yeah, well, we're okay to support it. This seems like an okay sort of policy. It was also statistically significant. With the Nudge Plus, when we allowed people to sort of develop these preferences and reflect on the policy before nudging them, we still found that there is a backfire effect, but this time, interestingly, the support went away. And we argue that this reflection, this capability of people to sort of form their intentions in the first place, helped them align their support and their own judgment of what they're going to do with this policy for themselves more correctly. and they were able to send this signal to us, but it could also in a policy world be as a signal to the government. It also limits concerns of manipulation, because if you are open and sort of allow people to sort of reflect very clearly, it limits concerns of manipulation because now it's more transparent. And in certain situations, caveats applied, it can lead to greater uptakes of policies, because sometimes reflection can also lead to reactance, and we do find that in a lot of cases. So I think the core message also is that we don't really want to replace nudges. I think we're calling to reform BPP, but in a way where these toolkits are more complementary to one another rather than being substitutes to one another. I think there are situations when nudges can be good, maybe redefined in certain contexts to overcome some of their concerns. But ideally, we outline 3 ways of doing this. So the first one, again, heavily draws on work of Ralph and Till in terms of boosting people's competencies. We think that allowing people to develop these skill sets is one way of allowing them to articulate their preferences more clearly. The second one has a longer priors than us, and this is something that Alice has been working on extensively for the last few years, which is about debiasing. The way a debiasing strategy works is, rather than presenting people with one choice, you also allow them to sort of reflect on the other extreme. So if there is a framing, you also give them the negative and the positive aspects at the same time so that they can reflect more broadly. And the third thing, as I said, is Nudge Plus, where we just allow them to reflect on the nudge or their personal preferences in question about the behavioral public policy. So we think that these 3 have different ways of working, but they have the one common goal, which is bringing together this agentic sort of capabilities in human beings. And there are lots of limitations. Again, as I say, I don't think we wanted to replace, and I don't think we're saying that this is the best, let's go with it. We know that there is a high cognitive demand with some of these policies. It really puts a lot of burden. Oftentimes I get asked about Nudge Plus, so how are you going to implement this in real life? And my answer is, I don't know. It really takes a lot of effort to scale these policies up. We've seen them with other sorts of deliberative approaches. So this is a big problem. The second one is repressive tolerance. And the idea here is, particularly with Nudge Plus, because the reflection task is also being designed by someone like me or a policymaker, if they also create the nudge, what is stopping them to design a reflection task that makes them more pro towards the nudge? So it could be a very one-sided reflection, which makes you even more supportive of the nudge. So we think that it can give people the false sense of agency, and this is something that I'm afraid of, which creates this problem of repressive tolerance here. I've already discussed psychological reactance, where some people, if their goals do not align, there can be backfires, but also some kind of spillovers where, it could negatively spill over, reducing your intentions to do other good things. So I think that's sort of the general idea. And we end this paper sort of with this recommendation that our discussion leads us to assert that behavioral public policy should be increasingly reformed to sort of promote agency based on also the other normative work going on in the field. However, we're very cautious, and we say that our radical approach does not necessarily overrule nudges. It simply is asking a broader adoption of a toolkit. There are lots of policies out there, including shoves and budges, and maybe each of them have a place. There are also complementarities of using them. So our ask is just, let's care about agency and let's see how the field can be reformed. So that's my pitch for today, and I'm ready to listen to all your views now and how you feel about this. And thanks for coming.
Okay, thanks, Sanchayan. Okay, so we'll take questions in the normal way. So if you've got a question or comment, can you put your virtual hand up, and I'll take them as they come. Tony.
Hit the wrong button. It seemed to me, I may have got this wrong, but there seemed to be a difference between your end point and your start point there. And when you talked about it being part of a broader toolkit, because at the start, what I heard was you saying we should start with the focus on agency. And what worries me with that is, in policy experience that people who respond to education-based or information-based initiatives tend to be the better educated. And if that's your starting point, I wonder if it makes that problem worse, because sometimes, if we're nudged into doing something that we had no intention of doing, and then we reflect on it and think, actually, that was quite nice. I enjoyed walking rather than getting in my car, or I enjoyed eating vegetable rather than having a pork pie. And then I can reflect on that and sort of, well, how did you feel after having your vaccine? Did you feel safer, etc.? You can reflect on that. So the nudge plus side, I wonder, sometimes nudge has to be the starting point. I think that just changing the choice architecture so everyone's in it, and then you can have information thereafter. So it's sort of nudge, then nudge plus sequentially. So I think that's the broader toolkit that I think would probably be more effective, rather than just thinking we always start with nudge plus.
Yeah, No, it does actually. I mean, you're also hitting sort of at the core of some things. I think in our original sort of nudge plus paper, Peter and I also keep the ideas open of sequencing these policies in such a way that sometimes the nudge precedes the reflection, and then the feedback sort of lets you, pretty much what you said, like sometimes, yeah, you can engage with the nudge. But I think a careful distinction here has to be made, because over the last few years, I've been working in different sort of fields. I've worked with vaccines, which can seem to be more personal. I've also worked with food, which is a very different kind of domain. And I think the results are very different. I think when you have more sticky preferences, I think trying to sort of meddle with those kinds of preferences, maybe the starting point should be more reflective agency-based policies. Whereas I think if there's something which is pro-social and you don't take it as such sticky, which I do find oftentimes with food, that the reactance with food policies is much lesser than the reactance with other kinds of behaviors. Like vaccines was really high reactance, but with food, the same kinds of things have not found. So I completely buy that. I think on your broader point of I think we argue in a different piece, it's still work in progress, that oftentimes capabilities of people, psychological capabilities, are very different because of how people are sort of being brought up. So me with I would say a good education versus somebody else with a not so good education might have very different reasoning capacities. And then there are inherent inequalities in that process. So if I then ask them to be boosted, I think that is just going to widen this gap between me and the other person. So I think in those kinds of situations, the choice again falls on this social planner of which one do you want to take and how do you want to sequence. But arguably, I think with boosting Nudge Plus, all the papers kind of say this is already for the people who are motivated, who are conscious, who have a conscience. So I think it also assumes a very specific set of the population. And maybe I should have clarified that this is not for everybody. I think there's a very specific target audience that we want to go and do this with. For the others, I think, yeah, you're right. Sometimes it's just good to do the other sequence.
Thanks, Sanchayan.
Is it? I mean, isn't the assumption that somebody likes pork pies rather than the salad because they're not educated enough to have ever tried salad a bit condescending of people that don't have much education? Anyway, I'll leave that hanging there, I think. Kristen, do you want to?
Yes. And I like steak pie with my salad. But now, Sanchayan, I know you knew the questions were coming, and I'm going to try to keep this kind of broad philosophical, a couple of things around what you presented on the starting point, because I know Malte's coming up next month with agency. So kind of focusing on some of this bit about the key thing you're saying being the starting point and that being very meaningful. And then also kind of bringing up that nudges in general do not cause sustainable change in behavior. I brought up the issue kind of for me about the future self and changes in preferences. And then if you have a sustained change in behavior, doesn't that in a way become a habit or automatic? So for example, and I work or research a lot on long-term care and stuff. So if you're looking at retirement, which I think you bring up, a lot of people bring up as a good example in your paper too, you have an intervention like a boost around that, where the person reasons and comes up with a certain percent of their paycheck they want to put in retirement. and they reason and they do this for the next couple of years to the point where it becomes automatic, and then the status quo bias comes in. You know, in the future, something may change. They might get diabetes or have a kid or want to get a house. That how do you feel in that sense where their future self, you know, they wanted to plan for retirement and do the best for retirement, but now because they've done this behavior over and over again, they may have a conflict between what their future self would want and their current self would want. And to make this truly about reasoning and to avoid that sort of repeat the status quo bias, do you think that people need to kind of revisit this? I think you had this kind of an example of planning, like every year, where they go really not just automatically click, yes, I want to keep the same thing, but is this reasonable for me? Look back in those factors. Like, how do you kind of, I think, address that, since that was kind of an issue brought up with the nudge?
Yeah, I like the retirement example. We use it a couple of times, right? I think, so here's how we think. So one of the problems with, I think, defaulting people into something that the future self would like, particularly let's take the 401k. I think it's problematic because let's say I'm being defaulted into a certain pension plan, and I don't reason it, and I just accept it and take it whatsoever. And I repeat it again and again and again without much thought into it, and then it becomes a habit. I just go along with it. Maybe it is not as good for me as it was now 10 years down the line to do the same kind of spendings. I mean, things are going to change, and therefore we sort of say that building in possibilities where you can reason at different intervals. We argue this sort of in the Nudge Plus paper, but also in our recent upcoming book. We have an example where we say, what if we change this one-time default into a default which allows you to sort of reason at different intervals, something like a multiple self-pledge, where it asks you to just sort of revisit your choice and reason it and still see if that's the right kind of thing. And an example for this, I think, is something like a New Year's resolution, where you start out by saying, oh, this year, I do this every year. Oh, this year, I'm going to lose 12 stones. This is my goal by the end of the year. And then I set out every month and I default myself into sort of doing the same kind of thing. But maybe every month, it's not the same kind of regime. I mean, now over summer, I might be traveling quite a lot. My food habits are sort of very awkward. I'm not eating the right kind of meals. I'm not getting time to work out. So I might need that kind of flexibility, which can only come in with reasoning that allows me to think, okay, these are my 3 months. I cut myself some kind of slack. And I don't really go in with the default I started out with the beginning of the year. Maybe that kind of default works at another point in time, but not necessarily at all points in time. And I think this is what a nudge does when it's sort of, when you don't reason and you're defaulted, it just assumes that the same nudge is going to be the right kind of nudge for you throughout, without sort of any kind of reasoning. We just want to bring in possibilities in different intervals where people can think, pause for a minute and just think that, is this really what I need at the point? And maybe, yes, if you need it, you go on with it, but there should be a possibility to revisit it. I don't know if you agree totally with the examples and totally with the reasoning there, but that's really what we're trying to argue here as our starting point.
No, I think that it makes sense what you're saying. I think there's kind of in practical speaking, which I think I was trying to keep a high level, there's issues with decision fatigue. I just think more like is how important it is if someone's decision at point A and point B kind of conflict at some point, and the importance to keep in those like different intervals as well. Because I think if you put the emphasis on sustaining behavioral change, that gives them the opportunity to change their behavior. If you're going to really put agency first at any point in that time. So it almost seems like the agency and the reasoning are kind of the key kind of focuses here. But I do see what you're saying and agree with the time point.
Okay,
I'll end there.
Leo, it's your turn. Leo?
Sorry, it's me now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, super interesting. Thanks, Sanchayan. I have 2 big points. The first point is that I have the feeling that if we follow you, then we make behavioral public policy quite irrelevant. There are 2 big challenges that you put forward. The first challenge is nudge is not effective enough to solve the big policy questions. The second one's the ethical challenge. You solve the ethical challenge, but by doing that, you restrict behavioral public policy to these specific boosts, nudge pluses, debiasing elements that are not enough to solve the big challenges that we have, thinking of climate challenge. So it's like I had a hat in front of in my inner eye, like make BPP small again or something like this. You know, it's a problem, I believe, that, and there must be a role for some policies that not in the first place, at least primarily, have to rely on agency. So there must be some policies that do not rely on agency. Otherwise, we will all lose our jobs, and that would be, it's not because of our jobs, but you know, it's neutral. Second one, budgets, for example, exactly, some hard regulation, the behavioral lens, and so on. There, so we should not make BPP agency reserved, but we should think of making the carbon tax work better and so on, which is not necessarily does not necessarily use agency. And that's just the first point. The second point is very short. There's a big literature that suggesting that preferences do not exist. You know the coherence critique. If preferences don't exist without a context, there is no starting point. So what do we do?
Yeah, I mean, I see this as you're gonna get me to lose this opportunity to talk. I can't make BPP irrelevant. I think Adam's never gonna invite me back again if it comes to that. No, jokes apart, I think I do agree with you. I think there's a very recent paper. I was also telling Adam and a bunch of other people who were at my workshop 2 days back. There's this Munich working paper series paper, I think came out a couple of weeks ago, that compares two different kinds of behavioral public policies. They call something a social nudge, which basically is like a default. And the other one, they call it a self-nudge, where people are allowed to sort of reflect on the policy. They also cite us, oddly enough, we're next to the self-nudge, and it should be really Ralph and who should have been cited there. It's kind of mixed up. It's like a nudge plus and a self-nudging there. But what they show in this paper effectively is that the social nudge is the most efficient in terms of, they do a public goods game, and it's the most efficient. It leads to the highest contribution to this pool, but it's also the least ethical. And then they show that the self-nudge under different possibilities of reflection can sometimes increase efficiency, but it's certainly not the most efficient, but it is the most ethical. So I think this trade-off does exist between the ethics of using behavioral public policy and sort of the effectiveness. And I think that was one of the starting points that Peter and I sort of had in developing Nudge Plus. And I think here, your question about ethics is, your question about the context, particularly climate change, is very important. So again, a lot of time back, I read this very interesting paper, which is called Regulation and Happyville. It's a fantastic paper based in, I think, 2009 or something, by two French authors. And they argue that sometimes paternalism is actually good. If the public is trying to make a decision, which at the end is going to hurt them, in those kinds of situations, I think the authors argue, I think in their paper, they have a specific example of a lead poisoning, how all the citizens living in this hypothetical city called Happyville are led to believe falsely that there's arsenic poisoning or lead poisoning in the water, and then they want the government to spend the money in sort of lead removal. But actually, the government realizes that there is no lead, and they want to push through with another policy, which rather seems to be paternalistic. So I think if really, yes, there is a vision and there are preferences which are sort of overarching, and there is a greater good, by all means go for paternalism, right? But I think our problem is when you try to make it seem like it's libertarian and yet it's paternalistic, when you try to give this idea that you have freedom, but you don't really have freedom. So I'm all in support for a carbon tax. I think with all my experimental work, I am becoming more and more convinced that a harder policy like a meat tax, for example, for food, would be much better to solve the problem than going for something like a nudge. But I think what a nudge does, it falsely leads you to believe that you're in charge, but actually you're not in charge. At least with the tax, it's outrightly, this is sort of the Rawlsian sort of critique, right? It's outrightly there. We're going to do this, and your preferences are going to be affected, you like it or not. I think this is not the thing that happens with a nudge. You're led to believe that you're in control, but you're not in control. And that's when we think the agency is really key to begin with, and you should really be allowed to sort of have your starting point. I think on your second one, I think this is more of an ideological debate, right? I mean, yeah, well, all my economics training tells me, yeah, preferences don't exist and they're all axiomatic, and then you have to be sort of, I don't really have an answer to that. It's going to be the same kind of conversation and the same kinds of things like, yeah, it's all contextual. I do think we have our choices, and sometimes we know what we want to do. So I don't really agree with the fact that we don't have preferences. Although I think it was Maltese paper where I can't remember now which one. He does argue something about current preferences leading to future and how it's all getting jumbled up. Anyway, I'm going to skip that one.
It's difficult to identify Maltese papers because you write so many of them.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
That's the problem.
I struggle to
Yuval.
keep up.
Yuval.
Yeah. Yeah. Hi, Sunshine. Really great presentation. So 2 questions. One is, and I apologize, I can't remember if it was on Adam's Twitter or it was Richard Thaler today. Someone tweeted about your talk, and he was kind of contrasting your argument with the Lowenstein paper, but right. So the whole kind of anti-nudge. I'm not sure who exactly who it was, but someone written about it in Twitter today, and I wonder because from your presentation, it didn't seem that you tried to kind of pick a fight with Lowenstein, but at least the Twitter presented it, whoever wrote it, as if you kind of try to the agency being kind of a counter argument. So I wanted to ask you what you think about that. The second question is more about kind of the role of institutions, right? So it seems that there are like individuals and there are all kind of laws, but in between there are all kind of institutional contexts. You could be in a corporation, you can be, I don't know, in the military, you can be in some, you have some representatives that in organizations. How is that affecting the needed level of agencies? Because definitely different institutions have different room for people to have their own agency and understanding and believing in what they do. So that's the second point.
Yeah, thanks, Yuval. Also good to see you. Yeah, I have no clue about this tweet. I'm going to go and look into it now. You make me nervous. I have no intention of picking fights with any of the people mentioned there. I also think I'm not particularly anti-nudge or anti sort of the idea of, Okay, here's what I think. I think nudges are good. Sometimes they work. I have specific problems with specific aspects of how the nudge works. I think if I were to list them, I think one, the word nudging has been very loosely defined over the last few years. I know I've had a couple of conversations with Adam about this. I think we really don't know what is a nudge and what is not, which leads to a lot of complexities in sort of dealing with these problems. The second, I think, is sometimes these nudges focus too much on the individual, and I agree with that, and they avoid these structural issues. So I have a new paper actually in BPP where we argue that you can still continue to focus on the I frame and still go to the S frame if we really wanted to use those terms, but by giving a bit more relevance to the sort of the social complexities around the nudge. So in which settings are the nudges being introduced, accounting for the heterogeneities, understanding the mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that would really be my reply to your first question. So I'm not anti-nudge, but I'm not really pro-nudge. I think there's a middle ground there where I think the nudge can be reformed and sort of advanced a bit more. And I do agree that it's a very cost-effective policy, even though Avishalom would say it's not cost-effectiveness, it's cost-benefit really, and we should do the net social cost. But I do think that it's an effective, cost-effective policy, and then sometimes it can lead to big effect sizes. But that does not mean that we can't reform it. I think there's still a lot of dimensions in which the nudges can be improved. And I know Patrick's here, and he's done a lot of work on transparency, right? Transparent nudges still work. It's just that we need to think a bit more around the conventional ways of doing so. What was your the institutions? I've not given it much thought really about the role of different institutions. I think in this paper, we really take a very consumer perspective about a citizen who's making a choice and is being nudged in certain settings. I guess top of my head, without much reflection, as long as I know what I'm signing up to, for example, with my new job, if I'm said that, yeah, you don't really have a say in this, and if I've signed up to that with reasoning, even if there's less agency, I have accepted the fact there's less agency, right? So yeah, it is again the reasoning. But if I'm rather tricked into accepting something which later boomerangs and comes to me as less agency, I think that would be a situation I would really hate. But again, I haven't given this much thought, so I'm going to take this back and maybe think a bit more about this, and we can chat later.
All right, Rupert.
Hi, yeah, sorry, hopefully I'm becoming visible. Ooh. Yeah, I was just Thanks for the talk. Sorry, I'm getting the talk. I'm just really interested in like these two assumptions you make at the beginning. One is that has already been challenged a bit, that like you can't, like without agency, a behavioural change, like a nudge, won't stick, like it won't have that lasting impact. So I think there are lots of situations you can think of where people have changed behaviour and brought up new habits without kind of intending to do so in a sort of agential sense. But the other end, I think, is also true about boost, right? So I think you can change. Boosts aren't necessarily agency building always, I think, in the sort of cognitive sense, maybe. So just to give you an example, the example I'm thinking of is we're just doing some work, working on online safety, right? And we're kind of interested in how do you make people do things like report content that they come across that they think is harmful. And one thing we're trying is giving them a little kind of a little micro tutorial in a way. So all it is basically you get people as they sign up for a new service, for example, you just make them like try out the function. So they have to click the report flag, type in a few things and sort of move on. So you're just showing them how to use the reporting function. You're not so much kind of motivating them to do it, or saying it's a good thing or anything. You're just like getting them to go through that process. And actually when we run it through, you see that people actually do tend to report more once they've kind of done that. And it's kind of questionable, like what's driving that change in behavior, right? And you could think, yeah, there might be some cognitive stuff. They thought, okay, just normalized it. It's okay. It's not as burdensome as I thought. There's probably some non-cognitive stuff. They've done it before. They sort of they've just sort of built their capabilities more than their motivation. So if you're looking at it through a sort of COM-B kind of lens, so you're not. I think the challenge to the boost idea would be actually we haven't really increased agency. We've just made something more familiar for them to do, and they've done it more in the future. So I would call that probably is a boost, right? But it's not necessarily agency boosting boost, so to speak.
No, yeah, excellent. I think I think the first point is something we recently had a revision for this paper, and I think this is something we were discussing internally within the team, and it also goes back to the point that I think Kristen was trying to raise, that sometimes repeating actions can also lead to some kind of reflection in people and some sort of reasoning. So it does not really have to be that this reasoning is inbuilt, and this is why I said that nudges, not all nudges are automatic. Sometimes the basic idea that you're being nudged makes you aware and makes you sort of reason it. And just an example of this, I was in India a couple of days back, and one of my cousins, he's a bureaucrat. He's an Indian administrative officer, which I don't know, I think it's an equivalent of a civil servant. So he's a secretary. And he told me he was doing something on the government portal, and then he was being nudged into donating something with a little sort of a default tick box at that. The first time he missed it, and then he ended up that the good didn't really cost that much, but he paid a bit more, and then he was really upset about it. But then he said the next time he went to the portal and he did that, he was consciously aware, where is this box going to be? And he made sure that he unclicked it and he sort of went through it. So I think some kinds of nudges would lead you to become aware through them if at the end you realize this is not where I wanted to go. But also equally in the direction and in the examples coming, sometimes you just take a walk and you feel that, yeah, the nudge that made me do so was good. So yes, some nudges do have the potential to sort of lead to this reasoning, and that then the behavior really sticks. At least that's how I would claim that behavior sticks, that it's the nudge that leads to some kind of reasoning. And also to argue that a nudge is completely automatic, I think is a bit too extreme. I think we're not really robots that sort of work on automatic cues. I think everything we do, there is a slight amount of thinking going on there. It's more or less sort of automatic. But this is something we do now address in the paper. So not in the version shared, but we do have a bit of more about sequencing and sort of repeated actions leading to agency being formed in the process. On the second one, you're absolutely right. I think this is also a limitation of boosting, but also nudge plus and debiasing, that not all of them sometimes are agency building. So sometimes they can also reduce agencies, particularly, I'm not so much, I'm not going to be talking on the turfs of boosts much because it's not my thing and I don't want to step on other people's work too much. But I think with nudge plus for sure, we find that there is this possibility that some nudge pluses can actually reduce agency rather than increasing it because of how this reflection task is being designed or being sequenced with the nudge. So we do take that on. And I do think that then it comes to the design question of the intervention.
Okay, we've got 10 minutes left and we've got 4 questions. So what I'm going to ask is not something of the questioners, but I'm going to ask you, Sanchayan, to make your responses a bit shorter if you can, with that in mind. Annelise.
Thanks. My first point was already raised in part. It's to do with what you say when you say nudges distort true preferences. To me, it really sounds like econ-like thinking, assuming that people have well-formed and well-defined preferences over a well-defined set of outcome. And yeah, I think my question is really about the generalizability of your claim, because yes, there are instances, maybe food, maybe vaccine, where people have well-formed preferences, but there are many other instances where arguably they don't. So have you thought about, defining the scope of what your analysis applies to? My second point is about how you conceptualize agency, and in particular, how would you explain the link between agency and articulating preferences? And my third point is, what makes you think that people would be ready to articulate their preferences or pause and think when prompted to do so?
No, yeah, lovely questions. Thank you. I do agree. The starting point, of course, is this. I'm trained like an economist. Peter also has a training like an economist. Till is trained in economics and philosophy. I think we're all very much in the econ mindset. And I do think it's safe to claim for all of them that our starting point is that people would have preferences. We really haven't thought about the situation of this ambiguity in terms of decisions where people might not have preferences. I'm going to take that point back, rather than trying, also because in the limit of time. In the second one about agency and how does it lead people to articulate their preferences, I think, again, we're conceptualizing this very sort of standard model in philosophy of cause and effect. And we're thinking that people will form these intentions. And the way we're defining this is, yeah, we're building people's ability to form intentions and then to act on these intentions. And the basic idea of forming intentions and acting on them allows them to sort of think through what they really want, which we think are the preferences. In terms of will people pause and think, a good empirical question and something we are testing constantly. We did a bunch again through the vaccine example, but also we're doing a couple of experiments now with thinking tasks and particularly trying to monitor this. And you're right, not everybody likes to think. I think some people would just like to go through with it. But I think, yeah, there is a lot of heterogeneity in this topic, and maybe for those kinds of people, really nudging. And this is why I'm saying we have a broader toolkit. We keep the broadness of the toolkit alive. I'm not saying that a booster or nudge plus is for everybody, but for the occasional person who would like to pause, or for the occasional topics where we would like them to pause, like climate change, and take responsibility and agency, I think these toolkits are more valuable.
Okay. Paul, you had your hand up next. Do you want to come in?
Just a very quick.
No, Annelise, because we've got 3 questions left, and we're going to do so much time. Paul, did you want to come in?
No, it's okay, thanks.
All right, Martin.
I asked Paul's question. No, just kidding.
Oh my God.
So I think Leo was, had excellent questions about, if you go down the agency route, what is behavioral public policy? I think there's a lot to be said from a behavioral public policy perspective about agency. And the boost literature is behavioral, right? But that's a response to Leo. And I think that actually your paper doesn't need the notion of true preferences. The philosophy of action that Till obviously is well versed in doesn't need the notion of stable preferences. It's really the ability to form actions and act on them, and to see yourself as the cause of your own actions, right? So I really think also in the paper to speak about genuine preferences is probably unnecessary. But here's a question. So the question is your account an objective or a subjective account of agency. And I think it's sort of like important if you think about the literature on well-being, right? I mean, there's the literature on well-being, and one of the big critiques there is, well, you know, you go down basically an objective list account of welfare. You know, you have this philosopher king or queen enters the room, says, here's a welfare criterion, boom, suck it up, right? Or is it something, you know, when you go down the subjective route, there's another bullet to bite. It would be a perceived sense of agency. Now, we can think of many, many situations, right, where people have a perceived sense of agency, but, you know, it's a very thin notion of agency from a philosophical perspective. So which bullet are you willing to bite? The philosopher king queen bullet, or the perceived agency bullet that is actually a very thin notion of agency?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is something that that has caused an internal rift within the team, actually. So I think Peter and I, especially in developing the Nudge Plus in the last few years, we're very much on the subjective route. So this perceived sense of agency where people really feel that they're in control, which is why also comes in the more sort of Marcuse or this repressive tolerance literature where, yeah, you could give people an illusion of being in control. And this is, I think, something that came out in the discussion with Till and Alice, that, yeah, the Nudge Plus might actually score the least points there, because what if I just make you feel like you're in charge of driving the car, but actually you're not? The car's been on autopilot all the way. Yeah, something we can discuss more, maybe Malte and Paul. I was actually afraid of the two of you because I'm not a philosopher, and I know you guys can sort of beat me down. But let's discuss this. I think these questions are big, and maybe something we can address in future work. Patrick? Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for a great presentation, Sanchayan. And also thank you, Malte, for bringing in the notion of objective and subjective agency here. So that's what my question is about as well. So I'm wondering about how strong really is the case that common instances of nudges are so bad for agency, basically. Like there are some, sure you are aware, there is a small literature subjecting people to not just asking them for how they experience their levels of control, how their ability to reflect on their choices, how well their choices align with their preferences. And the outcome from these studies, typically using defaults, which would be presumably one of the most agency intrusive kinds of nudges, the outcomes from these studies, I have one myself in BPP, is very strongly that people themselves feel very much in control of their choices, so feeling very autonomous. And I noticed that you did not discuss this in your paper. What are your thoughts on this literature and its potential relevance to your case?
Totally relevant, actually. So I know we're short on time, so I'm going to keep it fairly short. I think I sort of touched a bit on this, and our idea is we do cite this literature, going back to sort of, I think the Lowenstein paper, which is, what was it? Watch out, you're going to be nudged, or you're about to be nudged. I think that sort of led to a lot of this work. I think asking people after they've been nudged, whether they like the nudge or whether they're supportive of the nudge or whether they're in control, sort of goes along this argument that we're trying to make, that you've already been under the influence of the nudge. So you've already been affected by the nudge. So whether that is your, again, I'm going to claim genuine preference, or whether that is distorted, is hard to tell. So we have an ongoing experiment, and I would be able to shed some light, where we basically test this. It was very hard to get this past the ethics board, but we ask people whether they would like to be nudged. So we ask for consent, and then we override their consent randomly in a few cases and not in the other. And then we also debrief them by telling them, we overrid this because we thought this is good for you or not. So it's a 3x3x3 sort of factorial design, where we're testing, asking for consent, overriding consent, and sort of telling them what we did, debriefing. And I think this experiment will shed a lot of light on this question, that whether the ex ante sort of reasoning also aligns with the ex post reasoning, whether overriding this consent is actually good or not. So hold on there, but I know you're very interested in this, and me too, actually. So we could have a conversation on this more.
Just quick note there, if I may. So these studies are not only about what people think, like or not. There are also with procedural questions, like people's ability to reflect and etc., which shows very high levels of subjective.
No, I agree. I think, yeah.
All right. Okay. Well, the final question goes to Paul for today, then, who's decided to come back in.
Thanks, and thanks for the talk. It was fab, and I even like the crazy slides. They were great. But maybe because I've read too much sociology, when I hear the word agency, I immediately think of the word structure. And I think of the question of how structures or institutions can condition, facilitate and constrain agency. And I wonder if you've thought or would consider thinking about that, not least because it provides, and I think Malte was hinting at this, a potential response to the charge of nihilism. Because of course, one can think of certain institutions as being conducive to agency, largely independent of the particular preferences that people might have, or at least independent of the notion of genuine or true preferences. And that might be a way of avoiding the charge of nihilism that an economist might level, but which a sociologist might not be so keen on.
Yeah, I think, no, this is an excellent point. I think when I started out, I think the work with Ralph, which never really flew and we threw it in the bin, was trying to map out this. It was trying, I think the objective we had was to go in the different pockets of the literature, sort of, we mapped out 5 actually: sociology, economics, psychology, and a bunch more. And we wanted to sort of bring out what is agency and what is the definition of agency in these different bits and how can they be applied. We just felt that this work was too much for us to do with too little experience that we had in the different fields, which caused us to abolish it. But I think, yeah, I don't have an answer right now because we didn't really go into that. But again, this is something that could be rekindled and worked on, especially, I just saw the tweet again, Patrick, thanks. And yeah, the tweet has further comments that says there are different definitions of agency and work. So I'll be very interested in going and checking those out and see what the other work. But this remains of interest in how to conceptualize agency and how much to go far ahead with it. To what extent do we go with it? I think that would be my last sort of note. That didn't really answer your question, I know, but I don't really have an answer.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Sanchayan. And thank you all for attending. The final seminar of this academic year in this series is going to be given by Malte June the 22nd, that is planned for, and then we'll have a break for the summer period and return in October, I think.